We're joined by Hellmut Schutte, Emeritus Professor of International Management. He was speaking here at an alumnus reunion about new challenges for old multinationals. He was suggesting that the rules of the game are changing. What's behind that?
Now, we all know about the changes taking place in countries like China or India and the dynamics we find there. In fact, we see a rare occasion that there is some consensus among economists that the growth in these countries will continue to be quite spectacular. What is sometimes forgotten is that it's not countries but companies which compete. And companies find it rather difficult to cope with the new constellation which is taking place, especially in China.
What sort of problems are Western firms facing in China?
First of all, the market is very big. In many industries, we see that the Chinese market is already the largest in the world, or is moving towards representing even 50% of the world market. And we all have heard about cars, but we have not heard about trucks. We have not heard about fast trains. We have not heard about pianos or violins. I mean, there's an endless list of industries or product categories where China is moving into the position of being the number one in the market. That alone gives, of course, Chinese companies a tremendous opportunity to grow themselves. Something which the Japanese or Korean companies, which we have gotten to know as quite formidable competitors 20, 30 years ago, did not have. Secondly, China has let foreign firms come into their market. So I would argue that Chinese companies are benefiting from the fact that many multinationals already are represented in the country, and give them, if you want, a hard time. They can move towards a status of world-class competition already in their own country. Again, that was not the case back in Japan or Korea some 10, 20 years ago.
But this is competition based on low cost and imitation rather than innovation.
Now that is perhaps going too far, because in reality much of the success of Chinese firms at this very moment is based on low cost. But I think we have to see this in a dynamic perspective, that many companies in China are going away from that, are upgrading their technologies, partly by benefiting from the fact that the foreign firms are in their countries and are upgrading their technologies quite significantly. Very well known, for example, that the largest supercomputer is now one which is developed and stationed in China. In fact, among the 100 largest supercomputers in the world, 25 are located in China. So we are not only looking at low cost. I think we should rather forget that. We should be aware that China has at least the ambition to go into the aircraft industry and to match the standards of Airbus and Boeing within the next 10, 20 years. That China has started to export nuclear power plants. Now that is very different from talking about T-shirts and bicycles and cheap cars. That is perhaps the reality of today, but decreasingly so.
You're saying that the strategies that Western firms are using in terms of thorough analysis of the situation, high margin assumptions, risk aversion attitudes, those are all a thing of the past.
Foreign firms, by and large, have done very well in China. Surveys show that, but the real challenge for foreign firms is not so much the top end of the market in many given industries, but the medium sector, which we call the good enough sector. that's where Western firms have difficulties to access the market and to come out with products which are suitable for the given situation in China and India. I would include here in the same way. These are, however, the markets which will become more and more important. That's where the growth is. In many given industries, if we take the automobile industry, this is where the volume is very significant, and where I personally believe future battles for world market shares will be fought out. Now, when you come from a Western background and you are focused on the top segment of the market, let's say the Mercedes-Benz of this world, you find it difficult to get into the good enough market, which is very volatile, very fast moving, where trial and error by Chinese competitors is normal practice. And when you come with a very analytical mindset, risk averse, deep down in attitude, expecting high margins but relatively low volume, and being very slow in what you're doing, then you have a true challenge as a company in terms of strategies and strategy development and implementation.
What's your advice then to Western firms going into China, that they need to get into the middle market, that good enough market?
I think there's no choice. Companies have to get involved in this market because if you would leave that totally to the Chinese or Indians in the domestic market, at one stage they will go abroad and challenge the established multinationals, the old multinationals as I've called them, in their own territories in the West. So there is no choice. Most probably a much more radical approach towards strategy is needed. Disruptive technologies have to be brought in, radical changes in supply chain, and something which our colleague Chan Kim is sort of promoting, some thinking in terms of blue ocean in a very radical way. There are some examples already of Western firms who have done that, which have worked very well, and many others are challenged at this very moment.
So in essence, your argument is that the old multinationals have to take on the new ones in their own backyard in order to survive?
Yes. Strategically, as I said, you cannot move forward in this slow analytical way in a fast-moving, risk-taking environment. Secondly, to implement it, you have also organizationally, to some extent, one has to be careful, cut off your own people from the legacy costs and from the speed which exist at headquarters. So we see this now, interesting, across a large number of companies, that the country manager, who over the last years has somehow been reduced in size and disempowered, is charged again with much more responsibility. We see that the first companies are locating their global business managers or heads now either in China or in India. We see that the first companies are moving members of the board of Western firms towards Asia because they feel they are much more effective there and they have to be present and that applies to Cisco in Bangalore in India, as well as to Bosch or BASF in China, or very recently GE, which has decided to place their number 2 worldwide in Hong Kong to face the challenges in China or in India.
So you're saying that the battles fought in Asia today are going to be crucial because they'll decide world market outcomes?
Yeah, simply the size and the dynamics. And I should also say the deeply embedded optimism in Asia seemed to create a winner's cycle on the Asian side. To counter that, Western firms have to react properly, as they are in a very different world in their home countries, where cost cutting and outsourcing is still a priority. Companies are challenged in their way to see themselves at headquarters where decisions are taken for the world, in a way that one projects forward from headquarters into the rest of the world. That is challenged. I think the multinational of the future is an organization which is able to combine very different strategies in different parts of the world and pull that together at one stage. That organization which pulls it together may not necessarily be as headquarter centered as it was in the past.
So essentially a flatter organization that's more adaptable to local conditions.
And as such, much more difficult to manage.
Isn't it going to be difficult, though, for Western firms, the old multinationals, to keep up with the pace of change, along with consulting firms and business schools like INSEAD?
It is very much possible, because we see enough companies which are doing something. Some are still amazed about the speed with which this is all happening and are not really up to the challenge very clearly. But we see another interesting phenomenon, that in a larger number of Western multinationals, people who have worked in Asia are now moving into top positions. That applies, among others, to McKinsey. Out of that, I think, will also come a greater awareness of what's happening in the region and further decisions to disperse the organization across the world, and in particular in emerging markets such as China or India.
But if the rules of the game are changing so quickly, isn't it difficult to keep up?
Yeah, although nobody can argue today that there isn't sufficient information about what's happening in these markets existing. It is all in our mind. Let me give you an example. Last year, China became the world's largest automobile market. China overtook the US. For many of us, this was a bit surprising. I remember myself to have written a case study about 10 years ago on the automobile industry, world automobile industry, and China wasn't even mentioned in this case. It just didn't exist. It's now the number one. Now, argument number one, let's not take it too seriously, because it's number one only by volume, not by value, which is correct. Okay, so that, to my mind, doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't take it seriously. Number two, China moved ahead of the United States because obviously the United States had a very bad year, which we know, correct. So that will be somehow go back to normal, if you want. Now let me just counter this and argue the following way. If we just assume that the Chinese market will grow over the next 10 years with something like 7.2%. Now I take 7.2% because we know when you use 7.2%, then the number with which you start doubles within 10 years. So then the automobile market in China will be, with a growth rate of only 7.2%, will be 34 million cars. That is then not only by far the biggest, but is almost as much as the rest of the world together. Now, when you look at those developments, which are not that unrealistic, I think there's no excuse for companies not to open up their eyes and to do something about it. And very clearly, I'm talking here mainly about China, but in knowledge-intensive industries such as IT and pharmaceuticals, that applies in a very similar way to India as well. And we will also have to face that China again and India will move away from just selling cheap labor, but that they're moving also in knowledge-intensive, capital-intensive industries where they will play an important role. So there will be very few industries which will be excluded from this over the next years.
Hellmut Schutte, Emeritus Professor of International Management, thanks for joining us.